In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light, he only came as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known."
Thank you, Jill. I wanted us to have that reading because of the way that it highlights grace and truth. We're in a mini series at the moment looking at sex, sexuality, gender, identity, and it's really important when we look at these topics that we remember that behind topics and behind theory, there are real people. So this week, as we look at gender and identity, and next week, as we look at sexuality and attraction, it's not simply a topic out there. In fact, actually, I made the mistake of phrasing it that way when I put something in the newsletter about the series. This is something in here. There will be people amongst us who are, at the very least, not 100% sure of their gender identity. I'm certain that there are those at WCC who have experienced or maybe do experience some measure of same-sex attraction. And even for those who don't, most of you will have family or friends who do, whether or not you know it. And as well, I know that many of you whose hearts are for mission will be wondering what it would be like if you invited your trans friend or the lesbian couple down the road to WCC. What would it be like for them as they come? And that's why really I wanted to start off by focusing, and I'm going to put this up here. Hopefully that's not too distracting and actually helpful, because I want it to be there the whole time really that we're talking about this. I wanted to start with John 1. We have seen his glory. This is the glory of Jesus, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. You see, when we see a conflict between the scriptures and culture, most of us fall short on at least one of these two things, either the grace or the truth. And in fact, most of us only speak about something when one of those overpowers the other. We're so concerned about a lack of grace that we feel we need to speak out, or we're so concerned that truth is being lost that we feel we need to speak out. But as a result, sometimes we simply present what we see as being the truth, and we don't do it in a gracious way. Or other times our desire to be gracious to people causes us to let go of the truth. And we just need to be clear about this. Grace without the truth isn't real grace. If we want to show somebody grace, but in the process we let go of the truth, actually really what that is cowardice and conflict avoidance, if we're honest with ourselves. But likewise, truth without grace isn't truth. See, God's love and grace are an integral part of the truth. I really want to highlight that last bit. God's truth isn't like maths. Some of you will be very pleased to hear that, but God's truth isn't like maths, where you can state it all factually in a textbook. That's why God couldn't be fully revealed simply through the law of Moses, but only in a person, in Jesus Christ, because you can't separate out the love and the grace from God's truth. What you had left wouldn't be true. For Jesus, grace and truth wasn't an either or situation, it was a both and. We talked about it earlier when we broke bread. Jesus ate with fishermen, with zealots, with thieves, with tax collectors, with Pharisees, with lepers, the great and good and people who were right on the edge of society and seen as outcasts. And in eating with them, he affirmed their equal humanity. He knew what was in their hearts and he loved them, just as he still does today. We even read that the rich young ruler came to Jesus and first in his heart was not Jesus, not God, but money. And Jesus highlighted that to him. And yet, even though he knew that was what was in his heart, we read that Jesus looked at him and loved him. So for Jesus, grace and truth, it's not an either or, it's a both and, because at the same time, along with all of that grace, sitting with all those different people and not holding one to be above another, affirming all of their humanity, yet he also is exceptionally challenging. Sometimes we get to read what he says, sometimes we don't. We know that he went to eat with Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And the next thing we see is Zacchaeus saying, I want to turn away from my life of sin, repay the people I've cheated and give half my wealth to the poor. We don't know whether Jesus said something to him or whether it was simply the act of Jesus having taught everything that he had, coming and eating with him, that changed his heart. But something Jesus did or said was incredibly challenging to Zacchaeus, and his whole life was turned around. People heard it from Jesus. So if people heard challenge from Jesus, why is it that when we talk about tricky conversations, like, for instance, gender and sexuality, we tend to end up in arguments? I suspect that a good amount of it comes down to our imperfect love for people. Jesus loved people wholeheartedly, and they knew it. You couldn't spend time with Jesus without knowing that you were loved. And I wonder if that's true for us. I know that I need to grow in my ability to communicate my love for people, and frankly, my ability to love them, because that needs to be the love of God overflowing from my heart. But we also need to be under no illusions that some people heard Jesus's teachings and found them too hard to swallow, and they left grumbling. You could turn to somewhere like John 6 towards the end of the chapter. Jesus has been teaching actually on eating of his body, just like we've been talking about in breaking bread. And some of his followers say, this is hard teaching, who can stomach it? And they leave. There's also something that people could hear it from Jesus because he was clearly leading a sinless life. Jesus did the most amazing thing. We read about at one point him standing in front of a whole group of people and saying, can any of you prove me guilty of sin? He was so confident that he was living fully for God and living a sinless life that he could say that, and he knew that nobody could bring anything up that was sinful in his life. And we can cope with Jesus, the sinless one, telling us we're doing wrong. But we find it hard if it's our brother or sister who is themselves also a sinner. So we end up sometimes in arguments, we end up having more acrimonious discussions on these kind of topics at times, but that isn't how it has to be. So this morning, I'm going to teach through some of what the scriptures have to say about gender and identity, really only some of it. There is so much here that we could dig into, and I would really happily have longer conversations with anybody who'd like to about it. But we wanted to keep it to a week for now. There are other things that matter as well that we want to talk about. So this week, gender and identity, next week, sexuality. And at its core, it's the same theology that the church has taught for 2,000 years and that the Jewish faith held to for many, many years before that. And as an evangelical church, which is what we are, it's the view that derives from saying that scriptures are more authoritative than our culture. But I'm not going to call it the historical view or the evangelical view. And the reason for that is that those terms come with a significant amount of baggage. For large swathes of history and a large amount of the evangelical church as well, it's been taught, but without really listening to people and without teaching it with grace and with love. And so when we talk about the historical view, a lot of people will think, well, actually how this has been taught historically has been pretty loveless and pretty ungracious. But nevertheless, at its core, it's the same theology that has been taught for thousands of years by God's people. I do want to say as well, though, that there are some people who love Jesus wholeheartedly, who have a high regard for the scriptures, who are intelligent people and yet disagree with what we were going to teach this morning. That's actually the case with quite a lot of topics, not just ones around sex. But I think it's fair to say that none of the people who this church looks to as teachers and preachers of the word and receive as teachers and preachers in the church would agree with those dissenting arguments. So we're disagreeing, but we're disagreeing with respect and with love. I hope that makes sense. So before we get into what do the scriptures say about gender and identity, front and center, I want you to hear this from me. And I wanted to give this talk because I wanted you to hear this from me as the pastor of the church. Whether you are already a part of WCC, whether you're thinking about it, whether you're listening to some random video on YouTube that YouTube suggested to you and you happen to stumble across our stream, whether you're a visitor here at WCC for the first time, however you are or are not affected by today's topic, you're welcome. And you share that same dignity that everybody else in this community has. A child of God, falling short of the glory of God, yes, like all of us, and yet incredibly precious to him, yes, like all of us. You're welcome to attend, you're welcome to worship with us. When we're finally allowed to do it again, you're welcome to eat with us and to walk with us and to make the WCC community your home. Because fundamentally, by becoming Christians, we have all agreed to accept each other as we are, sinners saved by the grace of God. And perhaps amongst us also some who are sinners and are still deciding whether they want to believe and accept the grace of God, and there's room for that as well. So our aim in this church is that we all experience 100% grace. That is all the grace of God that is on offer. We want to show each other. I'm sure we fall short of that, but that is our aim, and we're not content with less than that. In my previous role at Oxford Community Church, I was asked in various different ways whether we were an affirming church, in the sense of, do we affirm LGBTQ beliefs at our church? I've not had somebody ask me that question directly like that here at WCC, but the conversation has come up. And this is where the going gets a little bit less comfortable for some, because just as we don't want to offer anything less than 100% grace, we also don't want to offer anything less than 100% truth. There's a huge amount in the scriptures that we as a church affirm and which sits very well with our current culture. In fact, there's a whole lot of things which our culture has taken a lead from the church in, and we could look at universal education, we could look at the fight against modern slavery, all kinds of other things like that. But there are also some things as a church that we affirm which are not currently popular. And there are some things that culture affirms that we don't see aligning with the scriptures. So what I'm going to do this morning is not to answer some headline question like, is it wrong to be trans, or something like that. I don't think those are helpful questions. They polarize the discussion in a way that isn't necessary. Instead, what I want to do is say, what do the scriptures have to say about identity, and what do the scriptures have to say about gender? And from that, we can then draw all the conclusions that we need along the way, but we know why. We look at the basis of it from the scriptures. So the first thing I'm going to say, and I hope the slides in the background are going to keep working. Yeah, they do. That's good. Okay. From the scriptures, Genesis 1 says that we are made in the image of God. Our first identity that we have as human beings is that we were created, we were made. We're not the creator, we're creations, and we're creations who are image bearers. That distinguishes us from every other thing that exists. It distinguishes us from rocks and from plants and from other animals. Only humanity was made in the image of God. But we are not creators. The Hebrew word that is used for God creating in Genesis 1 is a word that's never used about people creating. Even when they go on and do all kinds of incredible creative stuff, they're not creating out of nothing. We get to imitate our Father, but we are not creators, we are creations. What this means is that we don't ultimately choose our identity. Now that's a little bit unpopular, isn't it? We don't get to choose our identity. We're given our identity. We have been created. This doesn't just come up in Genesis 1, it comes up in chapter 5 and chapter 9 of Genesis as well. James picks up on it in his 3rd chapter about us being made in the image of God. And then this idea that our status is primarily with relationship to God. We're a child of God, and that comes up throughout the scriptures. But just for starters, John 1, we read it earlier, Romans 8, Galatians, Corinthians, the 2nd book of Corinthians, and Jesus talks about it in Matthew 18 as well. We are children of God, made in the image of God. This is fundamentally who the scriptures portray us as. The coming generations, that Gen Zs and millennials aren't really an upcoming generation anymore, are they? I'm nearly millennial myself, but those two generations in particular have been very keen on the phrase, be who you want to be your best you, those kind of phrases. And they have some real positives to them, because there are lots of artificial barriers that society or difficulties we face can throw up, and we shouldn't allow those to limit us. But that slogan falls down where it's taken to extremes that seek to make us the creator, and as though we could reinvent God's work. We can't be who we want to be, not entirely, because we have been made to be something by our creator. So that's the first truth that we want to draw from the scriptures. Our primary identity is as God's creations, bearing God's image. Because we bear God's image, it matters that we do it right. We want to be true image bearers of God. If we take our identity that God's given us and we say we want to be something different, and we try to portray something different, we don't fully bear the image of God as we're supposed to. The second truth that I want to pull out of the scriptures is this: God creates male and female, and he doesn't create them as interchangeable. This comes out in Genesis 2, but it also comes out in Matthew 19 when Jesus talks about this passage, and he talks about God creating male and female. And he does the same actually in the book of Mark, in the same passage related in the book of Mark. We read in Genesis 2 that Adam was alone in the garden, and it was not good. Everything else about creation was good and very good, but it wasn't good for Adam to be alone. And when that happened, it wasn't simply enough to make another of him. God didn't just make another Adam and say, look, now there's two's company. God made a new kind of human. And this differentiation of men and women continues throughout the scriptures. There's something about having male and having female that fully represents the image of God in a way that just Adam on his own could not do. And it's not just because there's more than one person and there's relationship, it's because there's otherness, there's difference. And so God doesn't create people who are a bit masculine and people who are a bit feminine and everyone in between, as though it was a spectrum. And this is where it doesn't line up with today's culture, which says gender isn't binary, but you can be everything in between. God creates male and he creates female. There's no indication anywhere in the scriptures of anything other than that. Interestingly, Jesus and Paul underline radically the equality of value between men and women. And this is often cited in support of there being no clear distinction between genders. Paul famously writes, there's no slave, no free, no Jew, no Gentile, no male, no female, but just Christians. And yet that same author, Paul, who consistently throughout Corinthians and Ephesians and both books that he writes to Timothy, makes very clear distinctions between men and women in all kind of other settings. He clearly can't mean that men and women are somehow interchangeable. But what he is holding up, and what Jesus also upheld, is a total equality of value. This is something that we can really, really champion as Christians, that you don't have to be the same in order to have equal value. And it really does us well to look at how God created men and women differently and say, both have wonderful value. Let's see both for the best that they can be, rather than saying they're totally interchangeable. This does really matter. One question, we had this open forum, sort of anonymous question submissions. And one question that was raised through that was why it would be okay to have plastic surgery or, I don't know, laser eye surgery, but having gender reassignment surgery wasn't. And I suppose the first thing I'd say is that I don't think it's helpful for me to stand up and make a blanket statement like all gender reassignment surgery is wrong, because whatever I think, that kind of blanket statement without actually engaging with the reality of that person and what what they're going through and what they feel, I don't think that's helpful. But what I would say is that gender reassignment surgery introduces an additional barrier in our physical body between the identity God has given us when he made us male or female and the identity we try to live out. So coming back to that first point, we were made to be image bearers of God. And if we take the image God has given us and we try to make it something else, we're putting a barrier between us and our fundamental purpose of portraying the image of God. It wasn't enough for man, as in male man, to try and portray the image of God. We needed male and female. And if we take what God has put in us that is unique and we try to make it a different gender, we actually let go of some of how we reflect the image of God. There is then a really valid question that gets raised. What about those who have an intersex condition? What about those who maybe are born with ambiguous genitals? Doesn't that prove that gender isn't binary? If you haven't engaged with this from a medical point of view, which I would totally understand, you may not be aware that there's such a thing. There are a whole number of different ways in which somebody can not be straightforwardly biologically male or female. There are chromosome irregularities, which mean that some people, instead of being XX or XY, are XXY, for instance. And there are other conditions in which people are born without normal male or female biology. And so the question is raised, doesn't this prove that gender isn't binary? Well, it does raise some interesting points, absolutely. It's really interesting as a society that disability is a protected characteristic, and we talk about wanting to remove any stigma from disability, and I'm wholly for that. But at the same time, if you call something a disability when somebody else doesn't see it that way, you're in hot water. So I won't talk about this in terms of disability, but certainly in terms of illness. It is still a medical condition, or rather there are a series of medical conditions which lead to somebody being born with what we call intersex characteristics. And they change what is otherwise a very clear, genetically unambiguous norm. Just because an illness exists that changes that, it doesn't mean that therefore the original paradigm is a wrong one. You'd do better digging into that with somebody from a medical background, but the Christian Medical Fellowship has a whole bunch of stuff on this, and Tim referred to it in his first talk. Maybe you could talk with him a little bit more about that if you'd like to. It is worth noticing that Jesus does actually talk about this in Matthew 19. Feel free to turn there if you want. He's talking about divorce, and he teaches on divorce, and his disciples turn around at him and say, if it's that strict, surely it would be better just not to marry in the first place. And Jesus says, aha, interesting you should say that, because, and then he goes on to talk about eunuchs. Now, if you haven't run into the term eunuch before, a eunuch, these days nothing like as common, was normally somebody who held a high civil service rank, and men who had their testosterone pumping through their veins were not considered to be quite as stable as men who didn't. And so there was a common practice in the ancient world of often as a child removing a man's biology down below such that they didn't produce their testosterone. They were considered a safer pair of hands. You could also trust them to look after your harem if you were a ruler, because they couldn't get up to anything with the women, and they were called eunuchs. And Jesus says, actually, there are three types of eunuch, because there are those who are born that way, and there are those who are made that way by others, and there are those who choose to live as eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. Now, the second one of those who are made eunuchs by others, that's people who have been essentially mutilated by somebody else so that they can be a eunuch. The third category is those who choose to live singly, choose to live without sexual union for the sake of the kingdom of God. But what's that first one? What does it mean to be born a eunuch? Well, the only thing that can possibly refer to is people being born without the normal sexual anatomy. It must be a reference to these people with intersex conditions. And it's just interesting that Jesus doesn't say they're not men and they're not women. He just says that they are born eunuchs. There is something incomplete about them from birth. In that process, he doesn't devalue them. He just acknowledges that that exists and says it's a different way to live. Okay, our primary identities as God creations. God made us male and female. They're not interchangeable. the next thing I want to pull out of the scriptures is this, and it comes mainly up in 1 Corinthians 6. What we do with our bodies really matters. Our bodies are a part of us. There is a notion that's crept into the Christian church, and it certainly has existed in Greek thought and a number of other places as well, that really when we die, what will happen is our spirit will go on living in a kind of floaty, ethereal way. And heaven is our spirits all floating around on clouds somewhere. But that's not what the scriptures teach. And it's not what Jesus showed. When he was raised from the dead, he had a resurrection body. He still had a physical body. He could say, put your finger in the hole in my hand, put your finger in the hole in my side. He could eat with them and consume the food that they gave to him. He had a resurrection body. So what we do with our bodies really matters. 1 Corinthians 6 talks about the fact that you can't go and sleep with a prostitute and then continue sort of engaging with the people of God as though nothing was any different, because he says you've been made one body with them. How can you be made one flesh with this prostitute and then come and sort of be one with God and not see a tension there? What we do with our bodies really matters. There's been a whole string over the history of the church of church movements that said either what you do with your body doesn't matter, it's not the real you, so you can live as licentiously as you like as long as your heart is pure. And on the other side of things, people saying the body is evil and it must be punished and beaten into submission. And perhaps you've seen that caricatured in Monty Python sketches with people hitting themselves on the head with wooden boards or things like that. But there were movements over time of people who said the body is evil and must be punished. And actually, the teaching of the church is no, the body is a part of us. Admittedly, this body will wear out and we'll be given a new one, which is better. But nevertheless, our body is a part of it. So when there's a dissonance, if you like, between our body and our mind, it isn't just the case that our mind wins out because our mind is the real us. Sometimes we do need to bring our body in line with our mind. That's part of what self-control is. Sometimes we need to say, I know I'm sort of feeling like I could eat another 5 of those chocolate brownies, but I need to not because it won't be good for me. Our mind is ruling over our body. But at other times, it's our mind that needs to be brought into line. And we do acknowledge this as a culture in some settings. There's a condition called body dysmorphia, some of you may know about it, in which no matter what you actually physically look like, you're convinced that you look different. It often leads to conditions like anorexia or bulimia. The person who I know best who suffers from body dysmorphia, she is extremely thin, unhealthily thin. It's a danger to her health. And yet she looks in the mirror and what she sees is a fat person. Now, in that condition, we don't say, oh, what you need to do is bring your body into line with your mind. So, actually don't eat any food because, you feel you're fat, therefore you are fat. We say, no, there's a condition here of the mind. There's an illness of the mind. What you need to do is be kept alive by continuing to eat. And we need to work through with you what's going on in your mind such that you're able to actually assess yourself in a true way and see the truth. So you see, it isn't always the case that the mind wins out. But when somebody experiences gender dysphoria, that dissonance that says, I know my body is a female body, but somehow I feel like I'm a man, or my body is a male body, but I feel like I'm a woman, or non-binary, or I don't quite know what I am. At the moment, our automatic assumption in culture is that the body is out of touch with the reality of the mind, and that the body ought to be brought into line with that, or at least that the mind wins out. But why do we assume that? In the face of biology and in the face of observable reality, it's because it's become culturally unacceptable to try to convince somebody that they are something they don't want to be, whether or not it's actually true. We do have a responsibility as believers to think about truth here. We don't automatically need to assume that it's the mind that wins and the body needs to be brought into line with it. So far, I've spoken about the dissonance between mind and body. For a lot of people, being trans is about feeling that your body and your sense of self don't line up. But actually, for some people, it's really got nothing to do with their body. So some people would say, I don't need to dress differently. I don't need to look at, changing my body with reassignment surgery. I just even though I want to keep looking like a woman to the outside world, I self-express, I self-define as a man, and it's just something about my sense of self. And at this stage, it becomes hard to kind of dig into what does this actually mean to self-define as a different gender, because what culture has been fighting for years, and I think largely successfully now, is to say that there aren't any roles or any jobs or any functions which are off limits to either men or to women. For so long, culture's been fighting, for equality, such that you don't have to be a man to wear trousers, or you don't have to be a man to serve in the armed forces. You don't have to be a woman to be able to cry at a film, or any of these other stereotypes that used to exist. So when somebody says, I don't really feel like a man, even though I have a man's body, I identify as a woman, really what they tend to be referring to is stereotypes within culture. I had a quote about this. I think it's probably too long. I'm going to leave it, but I'm happy to dig into that in individual conversation if you like. But largely, when people are not talking about being uncomfortable with their bodies, what they're then beginning to refer to is gender stereotypes. And we have a duty in the church to say, let's not just buy into gender stereotypes. Let's acknowledge that there are different ways to express masculinity and to express femininity. It doesn't always have to look the same. And you don't have to define as a different gender in order to live in a way that's different from the stereotypes. There's a really good example of this in the scriptures with Deborah. So Deborah is a judge of Israel. She's the only female judge over Israel, and she's one of a very, very small number of female leaders in the entire history of Israel, in fact. She's married to a man called Lapidoth, but she's the judge. She's the one who makes the decisions. She's the one who leads Israel. And it's really interesting. The scriptures don't make comment on that, and they point to some of the prejudice she experiences. And that's a really interesting thing in itself. But they don't say that she lived as a man. They don't say she sort of acted like a man, or that she was a man, or anything like that. They just say that she judged Israel. And I think we have a duty to do this well in the church, to say you don't have to be a man in order to fulfill some of these, sort of roles, some of these stereotypes that have traditionally been set aside for men, or for the opposite for women as well. And then if we do that, perhaps the effect we can have on culture is to say you don't have to redefine yourself and start using different pronouns and call yourself something other than what your body defines you as, other than what you were created as. You can simply just be a bit different. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a slightly fuzzier one. It bears further conversation. I've toyed with how to say it, and it's been really, really quite hard to put this in a pithy way. But ultimately, the best I could come up with is this. There are different ways to express masculinity and femininity, and that includes within the church. But I do want to loop back and say some of it really does come down to our desire not to be defined by somebody else. We want to self-define. We don't want to accept the identity that God has given us. And along with a bunch of unhelpful gender stereotypes and possibly hurt, and sometimes in some cases trauma, there's also a bit of rebellion. We like to think that we're starting with a blank sheet for our identity, and we can forge whatever we like, but we were never given a blank sheet. We were given a body, and we were given a mind, and we were given a character. And God knew all the days of our lives before we were even knit together in our mother's womb. Okay, I'm bringing this into land. So what? Well, look, the way that we live as Christians is supposed to be loving, and it's supposed to be open, without pretense and without condemning others. As Christians, we are committed to that. As a church, we're committed to that. So that means it should be a really safe place for somebody to say if they're struggling with a conflict between their body and their sense of self. I would love this to be a community where people feel free to do that and know that they won't experience judgment or prejudice. The fact is that we don't live like that in a lot of areas. There are lots of things that we keep hidden from each other, and I'm not just talking about in the area of gender and sex. The truth is, any time that we keep things from others, any time that we keep anything that we think is less than ideal or that the scriptures don't agree with hidden, it nearly always causes us harm. 1 John chapter 1 talks about walking in the light like Jesus is in the light, not hiding things in the shadows. This should be what we should aim for. So I'd like to set this out as a goal for us. We should be, and we aim to be, the kind of community where that kind of conversation, so somebody saying, I experience gender dysphoria, I'm confused about the fact that even though my body is male, I feel feminine and I feel like I want to identify like that. We should be the kind of community where that kind of conversation can happen without anybody jumping to conclusions or passing judgment. We need to grow up to be that kind of community. It will be required of us by society around us, and for good reason. As Christians, we also commit to lifelong change, though, in any place where our lives don't line up with God's intent. And that means using the plumb line of the scriptures against our lives. So as Christians, we don't get to say, this part of my life is off limits. I'm going to do what I like in that. God can have the rest. Because we claim Jesus Christ as our Lord. Lord means it's up to him, not up to us. So we don't get to compartmentalize our identity and say, look, I'm going to define myself like I like. You know, every other aspect I'll live for God, but that bit there, that's for me to decide. Having said that, God takes things at his pace, not at our pace. And he's often way more patient and gentle than his people are. So just because something in somebody else's life might not line up to the scriptures, it doesn't necessarily mean that right now that's the thing to address. Jesus took his time addressing Simon Peter's rash impulses, didn't he? And James and John's fiery temper, for instance. So there should be a gradual process. If you're well embedded in the community already and you start to talk about questioning your gender or your sexual orientation, you should be able to expect continued love and continued lack of judgment. But also over time, you should expect those closest to you to start asking some searching questions and to occasionally be provocative. That's part of 100% grace, 100% truth. It's our call. Colossians 3:16 says, let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. But just as from those closest to you, you should expect that kind of interaction, others should keep their views to themselves and trust those who are more closely involved to be doing that well. If somebody in our church was going through marriage counselling, we wouldn't all expect to have a say and throw in our opinion and our tuppence worth, would we? We would pray from a distance and we would trust those who are more closely involved to be more closely involved. And the same should be true in this area. So if you are a transgender or non-binary visitor walking through the doors, you wouldn't expect any of that to come up because you're new to the community. You wouldn't expect anyone to make any comment on your gender at all. If you stick around and you increasingly become part of the community, you'd increasingly expect for other believers to be able to speak into your life in all kinds of ways and not just to do with that area of your life, but to do so in a context of love and relationship and not of judgment. So if that's the case, if we want to be pastorally gentle and respectful and patient, why are we teaching about this on a Sunday? And this is my closing thought, really. It is important to have boundaries. Some people undoubtedly experience genuine gender dysphoria, and it's an ongoing thing, and it's deeply distressing to many. But the science shows, and this is serious scientific studies, that 90+% of people who experience some form of desire to be another gender in their youth or childhood just revert back to being comfortable with the gender that matches their body without any intervention. However, these days, as soon as you start to experience that kind of dysphoria, culture just gets in and says, oh yeah, that's fine, just define yourself as the alternative and maybe take puberty blocking hormones so you have longer to decide. And we start messing with the body's process and playing merry hell with the hormones in a way that is really quite troubling to most medical professionals. And we take out that possibility to just naturally right ourselves and make it much more complicated. And so that's why it's important to set some boundaries and say, well, actually, Christianity says that your body and your mind are created to go together and to be one as one whole identity given to you by God. Also, we want to have 100% love and grace and 100% truth. If we hold scriptures to be true, it's not loving to diminish what they say simply because it can be hard to hear. So that's why we're teaching about this on Sundays. In closing then, there is an exercise of faith for all of us. It will be easy for some, it will be harder for others. And that faith is to say the identity that God made for me is better than my own reinvention, however fitting or comfortable my reinvention might be. God reminds us again and again through the scriptures that he's the creator, we're the creation, and he invites us to trust him in that. In just a second, we're going to sing a song that declares that truth. The chorus is, I am who you say I am, and we'll be singing that. I just want to invite you to do business with that. However much this affects you or doesn't affect you, do business with that truth. I am who you, God, say I am. And if you want to talk about this any further, do please have a conversation with me or with one of the leadership team off the back of this morning even. Now we're going to sing and worship God again. I am who you say I am.